when you think about this year, I wonder what will stand out as one of the biggest takeaways for you. For me personally, it's actually the subject of hope. And when I say hope, I just kind of, a real simple definition is like a specific desire or expectation for something in particular to happen. That's all I kind of mean by it. And if I was to ask you the question, as Christians, if you're a Christian watching this, where should we put our hope? We would know the right answer, which is in the person of 1, 2, 3, Jesus. Yeah, so we all know the theory, but when I think about this last year and how I've handled it and how I've walked through it, it's been kind of shocking to see, although that theory is there, the actual reality, when I look beneath the surface on an average day into my heart as to where I kind of get my hope, it's been in 101 different other places. It's I say my hope's in Jesus, but actually my heart, the energy and the life that I'm really drawing from is like the hope that the restrictions are going to lift, or that meeting coming up with that specific person is going to, make me feel better. Or I don't know, it could even be silly things as like, I've spent more on Amazon in the last year than probably my whole life. And honestly, I've seen a specific like pattern between an Amazon delivery coming and, it doesn't have to be something exciting. It creating a sense of like energy and joy and basically functional hope in my heart. Oh, look, it's just 6 stops away. It's about to come. When I was getting my puffer jacket a few weeks ago, man, the amount of unconscious like hope I was putting in getting it, at one level is comical, but man, it's actually really profound and ultimately incredibly dangerous. Now, just to say right at the beginning, I don't want you to mishear me. To be human is to hope. I'm not saying it's wrong to hope in anything, in your child growing up to be happy and healthy, or in that vacation that's coming up that you're putting so much hope into. It's not wrong to hope for things, okay? What I'm saying is there is a difference between like small h hope and what the Bible gets at, which is this journey of learning to put our kind of capital H, heart's hope, more and more on Jesus Christ alone. And if you've got a Bible, turn to Hebrews chapter 7, because what's fantastic is that in amidst a somewhat complicated chapter in some ways, it's about a guy called Melchizedek, etc. Right in the middle of it is an incredibly practical, profound idea. It's this idea of hope. And what the writer to the Hebrews is trying to get them to understand is he's in verse 18 and 19, we'll read in a moment, he's trying to first of all wean them off doing what we are still doing 2,000 years later, which is putting too much hope in things that were never designed to carry that. And then secondarily, getting them to learn to day by day hope more in the reality and the person of Jesus Christ. And these guys, these Christians, this was so relevant to them, because as Hebrews, as Jewish Christians, for them to follow Jesus had meant that they had actually, it seems that they had been pushed out of their entire previous cultural way of life, that friends and families had turned their back on them because they were saying Jesus is the Messiah, and the most of the Jews were saying no, he isn't, which means that they had lost all the things that they were probably tempted to put their hope in previously, in family and in friendships and in the temple and in the priesthood and in physical things. All of that had been just stripped away from them. And instead, they now had just Jesus, this invisible person. And so this whole book is like helping them to understand, to wean them off a lifetime's habit of your heart, putting too much hope on anyone or anything or any scenario or anything coming up than Jesus, and learning to proactively put your heart's hope more and more on the reality of Jesus Christ. In verse 18, there's the weaning. He says, the former regulation is set aside. He's alluding to the whole of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the whole previous way of life, because it was weak and useless. The law made nothing perfect. There's the weaning off. But secondarily, he's then wanting them to lean into this new way. And a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. And I love that word there, better. He's not saying it's wrong for you to have hope in a marriage partner or a hope in that new puffer jacket that's coming. There's nothing wrong with that, but he's saying there's a better hope. That Christians, we must learn to place our heart's true weight of hope and expectation in the invisible and yet profoundly real person of Jesus, because there's two huge differences in him as our hope in contrast to every other place we could put our hope. Number one, Jesus alone is a hope who is permanent in a world that's constantly changing. And number two, he alone is a hope who is perfect in a world that will be consistently disappointing. He is permanent and Jesus is perfect. Let's look here at these two ideas. First of all, this whole idea of Jesus being a hope that is permanent. Here in verse 23, he says this, "Now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office." So he's trying to wean them off a place they put too much hope in. And I'll explain this in a moment. There have been many of these priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. And therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. It's an amazing few verses. And what he's saying is this. First of all, it is totally right and normal and appropriate as a human to have a hope for things to be permanent. That desire in all of us for things to basically stay the same, that basic aversion in nearly all of us for change, is a good thing, is what he's saying here in simple terms. The problem is when we put our hope for things to be permanent in anywhere other than Jesus. That's the first problem he is just wanting us to realize. It's good and right to hope for things to be stable and permanent, right? The problem is when we hope for things to be permanent that were never designed to be permanent. Now, the illustration that he's wanting to bring to them that would have been super relevant to them is this whole thing of the priests. These priests, there have been many of them since death prevented them from continuing their office. Now, what's he saying here? See, for a first century Jewish Christian, they would have grown up and the priesthood would have been synonymous with hope. You know, that God had been so kind to this people, Israel, in giving them a temple and a priesthood, men who were set aside to offer hope. When they mucked up, when they sinned, what do? There's a way out. You don't have to despair. You grabbed your sacrificial animal, you got to the temple, you came to the priest, and you confessed your sins, and he, with a smile on his face, would say, "Leave it with me. Thank you for your animal. It's all going to be okay. I will make sure that things are sorted out between you and God." Now, this was a tremendous gift to planet Earth, that there really was a place that you could get hope. And what he's saying is that, these priests who undoubtedly they would have got really close to, they're kind of leaders, they're pastors, they're shepherds, almost like they're counselors. These men that they would have come to weekly or at least very often, and they would have told them their most innermost dark secrets. I mean, who do you do that to? I mean, it's a big deal. And what would have happened is they would have got emotionally, undoubtedly, very close to these men, these priests. They would have told them what they needed to take, get it off their chest, and then, I know there's going to be forgiveness through what they do in offering my animal that I've brought as a sacrifice. It was a wonderful source of hope. The problem is, of course, as he points out, they had this little tiny habit, unfortunately, of dying. He's saying, look, even with this wonderful thing, the priesthood, which was my gift to you, it was deliberately set up so that although it would be a place that you would put some hope, it was never designed to be a place that would relieve your human desire for permanency. Even built into the system, the fabric of it, the fact they kept on dying was my way of kind of hinting to you, hey, this is a good thing, but don't let this become a God thing. And obviously here today, you are probably thinking, well, that's all very well, Tom, thanks for that little history lesson, but I'm not actually like struggling with an over dependence on the priesthood, thank you very much. But let me ask you this question. What is your equivalent? And the reason I ask that is because I promise you there will be a 21st century equivalent in your life. And here's the real key. The reason this is so important is because if we keep unconsciously putting our hope in certain things to stay stable and permanent, which were never designed to kind of bear that weight. Here we go. We are just a heartbeat away from hurt. The connection between wrong-placed or ill-placed hope and hurt is so clear and close. Whenever we put our hope unconsciously on things to stay the same, for those things to be permanent, they will inevitably, if it's not Jesus, they will inevitably change. They will inevitably shift, and we will be in great danger of getting hurt. That's the problem. When we have put our hope in the wrong place, we're just a heartbeat away from hurt. It can be so many different things. It can be, it could be in our bodies to stay the same. I'm 43, and as I've got grayer and a little rounder, I am confronted with the reality that even my ability to snowboard and to stay fit and to do things that I'm used to is changing and shifting. It's not permanent. It's not the same. Relationships in this time which we would have gone to. How many times? I'm sure you've experienced this, particularly in the last year here in the States. Are you having a conversation with a friend and suddenly you realise they are not on the same page as you, politically or in some other worldview, and suddenly things change and you're like, oh wow, I kind of thought this relationship was going to be, I unconsciously was putting a lot of weight on it being kind of permanent, but actually it may not be. Living in San Francisco, we are so particularly craving stability, right? One of the most transient cities in the world. And we can be those who therefore unconsciously are looking for stability in so many other places. Even as our kids grow up, man, I just dawned on the fact that, I'm about to have now 2 of my 3 girls be teenagers, and it's wonderful and I love it. But it is just sobering. Our hope in our family life sort of being the stable, unchanging thing, even that is a very dangerous place for Tom Shaw to put his hope, because it is always changing. It is always shifting. They're not my children, they're God's, and they are growing up and things will shift and change. And when I don't realise that, when I don't live in the good of that, I'm so in danger of putting my heart in the wrong place. I remember a few summers ago, back in England, over 1 week, I'd led a big conference, a college ministry conference for years, and I put so much hope into it. And through different circumstances, I stopped leading it. And the same week, the church building project that we'd spent 3 years and huge amounts of money on working towards, the last minute was ripped away from us. And I remember sitting in my living room as the night drew in. I didn't bother putting the lights on. I just sat there, so sad. And it was so painful. These things that I had just been so confident were not going to change had been exposed as just like vapor. That they, in a heartbeat, could be taken away. And it was so painful. And there was so much hurt that I felt. And yet at the same time, here's the truth, it was one of the kindest things that God's ever done. Because it just dawned on me as I sat there, like, well, wait a minute, if even these things are not permanent, they're not actually very stable at all humanly. Man, that's really painful. But at the same time, like, it kind of revealed, this isn't a stable place for me to put the weight of my heart's expectations. I wonder what yours might be. Right now, even the Spirit will be, I'm sure, showing you things that potentially you are hoping for to be more permanent and more stable than necessarily they may be. It may be friendships. And then, maybe you're friends with someone and then suddenly you hear she's engaged and outwardly you're excited, but inwardly you're like, seriously, so devastated because our hearts had been unconsciously hoping in that person to that relationship to never shift. I wonder what it might be is a sanctuary grows and changes. Things that we would hope would stay the same will change and are changing as more and more people come, which is wonderful. Things inevitably will feel different. And if our hearts unconsciously are hoping in sanctuary to stay the same very intimate small group, and actually God's wanting to bring many more around the table, if our hearts are unconsciously leaning on having a sense of being in the inner circle and being connected right in the shaping of it, and we're not ready for things to shift and change, that can be very, very difficult and a place where we can easily get hurt if we are not holding it a little more lightly. And that's what the writer is wanting to do. And he goes on, he says, don't put your hope even in the priesthood staying the same. He says, because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. He's able to save not just a tiny bit, but completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. And he now says, yet these things, whatever it might be right now that you are in danger of putting your hope for things to be permanent in, those things will change and shift. Everything is changing. Everything is shifting. You're getting older. Things are falling away. Nothing's staying the same, apart from Jesus Christ, who lives to intercede for you. And he's painting this picture of like this incredible throne room, and the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and the Son is like pleading, praying joyfully, passionately for you and me. And this language of he lives to make intercession. He lives to intercede. It's like the language of, on American Idol when they interview people before they're auditioned. It's like, and they say, I just live for music and to be famous. It's this kind of language. And Jesus is wanting us to know that this is the kind of passion that this permanent Jesus, this unchanging Jesus, has for you and me. And he's like, that's what I want you to lean on. I want you to actually increasingly not live by sight and by putting the hope for things to be stable in anything that you can almost touch or feel or is physical around you. As good as those things are, they're all ultimately shifting and changing. I want you to live by sight, I want you to live by faith, not by sight. To live increasingly with the eyes of your heart fixed on this image of Jesus Christ interceding for you with joy permanently. It's wonderful. And it's like, it reminds me a little bit of sometimes in the morning, Josie and I will get up in the morning, or we'll lie in bed and we'll chat about our kids. And sometimes we start to pray for them. We intercede for them. And as we do that, so often, strangely, the very child we're interceding for, the door creaks open and in comes Poppy Grayshaw, half asleep. And we're like, darling, you will never believe it, but we were just talking about you. We were interceding for you. Come in, come jump in between us, and we'll finish off our prayers. And inevitably, whoever it might be will joyfully jump in and enjoy and savour hearing mum and dad interceding for them. And this is a tiny picture of Christians, what Jesus Christ what he paid for us at the cross, when he went to the cross and he suffered the wrath of God, the righteous wrath of God for my sin, and he rose from the dead and he poured out the Spirit. You know, the Calvary is our permanent hope, that something that's already happened, a past tense permanent hope. But this is like a present tense and almost a future hope. He's saying right now, this Jesus, he's interceding with the Father. And the Christian, he says, draw near. For those who draw near to him, it says in the ESV or the NIV, those who come to God. He's saying, come close to the bedroom. Come close to the throne room. Don't be ignorant of the atmosphere of the Trinity that loves and delights in you. That, my friend, that is one of the great secrets of the Christian life that will never change. It's unchanging. It's permanent. And when life falls away from you and everything that you thought was going to be stable and rock-like just is taken away in a shocking moment, he's saying, as he was saying to these guys, it is true for them as it's true for us. Jesus still lives to intercede. Come close to the bedroom. Listen. Come through the door. Live in that atmosphere. And that's why Paul can be in prison with everything taken. Nothing's permanent. It's all gone. And yet he's just singing to God, it says, at midnight with one of his team leaders or one of his partners. I can't remember which one it was. He's singing to God because he's learning what it is to put his hope in the permanent, interceding Jesus, not in things that will shift or change. That's why Paul can say, I've learned to abound and to be brought low. You know, to have everything taken away, to have all those things that I would have put my hope in just ripped away. I can do it all through Christ who strengthens me. So first of all, he says, Jesus Christ is the only permanent hope. Man, we need that. Where are you in danger today of putting unconsciously your heart's hope and energy and source of joy in something staying the same and staying rock-like, which actually in a moment could change? And God says, no, I want you to today start to spot that. But Paul, the writer to the Hebrews, with this first bit, he smashes that at the park, and then he does it again in the next few verses, because he now starts to shift not just from hopes being permanent, but to hopes being perfect. Here in verse 26, he says, such a high priest, that's Jesus, the permanent one, he meets our need. One who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he doesn't need to offer sacrifices day by day like them, first for his own sins and then for the sins of his people, because he sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself at the cross. The law appoints a high priest men who are weak, but the oath which came after the law appointed Jesus, the Son, who has been made permanent forever. Again, he's saying here, your desire as a human for perfection is actually good. The problem is when you unconsciously hope in the wrong things, i.e. anything other than Jesus, to be perfect. Because guess what? That way of living is also a sure path to hurt anyone or anything that unconsciously we are putting this enormous, unconscious but real weight of things, this thing being perfect, on that thing, on that relationship, or on that church, or on that job that's coming up, or on that vacation that we're so wanting. Anything that we unconsciously are hoping to be perfect other than Jesus will always lead to hurt. And again here, what he's doing, he's continuing this helpful analogy for them of the priesthood. He's saying, you see in verse 26, he talks about Jesus in this like fireworks verse as like holy and blameless and perfect. And then in verse 27, he's deliberately like coming back to earth with a bump, where he's showing them how, in contrast to the perfect Jesus, the perfect priest, all the other priests that they so idolized, these leaders around them, they didn't just keep dying and weren't permanent, they were also far from perfect. They had to, when you came to them and said, oh, I've got all these sins you've got to sort out. Do you know they had to constantly sort out their own sins as well? They were trying to deal with your sin, but at the same time they would have just had a blazing row with their wife in the car park, and were like, yeah, well, I'll try and sort your sins out with the Father in a moment, but before that I'm a mess today. I've just blown up with my kids, and he's deliberately wanting in these two verses, in verses 26 and 27, for us to see a huge gap between the spectacular, perfect priest, who's Jesus, that we can go to all the time permanently, and every other kind of human leader who is anything but perfect. And if ever there has been a year or two where we have seen our equivalent to the revealing of the imperfection of Christian leaders, if ever there's been a time, it's been now. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there have been so many apparent spiritual giants who have been exposed as so far from perfect. It's been pretty devastating. And I don't want to in any way imply that that's not a big deal. It's a huge deal. However, ultimately, what the writer to the Hebrews is saying to them and to us is that part of this whole Christian thing is this. It's a strange thing to say, but bear with me. Is part of Christian maturity is a healthy disillusionment with things that we could be too illusioned with. We sometimes think as Christians, I'm too negative. I should just be more positive. Not always the case. Sometimes we're too positive about the wrong things. We put too much hope in things that are just things, leaders and people and roles and whatever it might be. One of the big issues in the Christian life is that we are unconsciously putting so much expectation, often on ourselves. As one example, I say things like, oh, nobody's perfect. But the reality is I hate not being perfect. I hate my limits. I hate my fragility. And you might say, oh, Tom, I'm sorry for you, but I'm not like that. Well, let me ask you this question. Do you struggle at times with drivenness? Are you confused at times when you can't solve something? Well, in which case, unconsciously, you may be having an expectation of your own perfection more than you realise. You see, the thing about this is that the more that we are able to say, I and all these things around me are good gifts, but they're not God. They're just gifts, imperfect gifts. They're not perfect. The more that this kind of gets into almost into our being, into our body, it actually liberates us and leads to so much joy, so much intensity and lack of contentment in San Francisco and around this world. It's because unconsciously we are putting so much intense expectation on our job or our role or our financial situation or whatever it might be, or our children or our education. And all these things are never meant to bear the weight of perfection anyway. The more that we can say, about ourselves, I am average, I do not have to be spectacular, which is what the whole of the San Francisco culture tends to pump into our being, that you have to be this top 0.01%, to have impact in this life. Absolute rubbish. The reality is we will always come up against someone who is cleverer, sharper, more strategic, more gifted, particularly living in San Francisco. And we have to deliberately allow ourselves to know it is ridiculous to put any hope of perfection in myself. I have to be appropriately disillusioned with all these other things, and to increasingly be illusioned, to be envisioned, to be in faith for the only person who's truly perfect, which is Jesus. And I know for me, I can hear that, and then my life, my actions betray when I'm driven and I'm anxious and I'm confused. I found myself confused that I haven't been able to solve all these problems, and there's so many loose ends week by week. And then I've thought to myself, why am I confused? Why am I surprised at why I haven't solved everything? When the reality is I am so far from perfect. I am so limited. I am such a fragile man. And the older I get, the more I realise it. Like, I'm more aware of that, not as a platitude and a fake humility. Genuinely, I am so limited in my processing ability. Why would I ever be confused when there's loose ends or things that I can't figure out in my brain? I had a leader come up to me, I remember years ago in Canterbury. He's a friend of mine, and he came up and he was just like, I've been a bit concerned the last few months about your ability to lead this church. And then I thought he was going to say, but recently I've realised how incredibly gifted you are, Tom, and all my hope in you has been restored. It never came. The positive bit just never came. He just sort of like said it, vomited on me, and sort of wandered off. And at first I was kind of like, how dare you? Do you not realise the phenomenal blessing that I am to you? And the more I thought about it, the more I kind of over time felt the smile of the Father as to be like, Tom, you know I love you, right? But he's kind of true what he's saying. And it dawned on me, like, why would I ever be under the illusion that I had enough humanly firepower to lead this church? What would ever lead me to be so deluded as to my own strengths? And I actually was able to just laugh and go, man, I am so far from perfect. And you know what? The more I can live in that and live entirely dependent on the grace of God to do all the things that he's calling me to do, the more that I can live like that, the better. And I would say the last few years planting in San Francisco, I said this recently to Billy, I said, you know what? I have been just so profoundly aware of how differently I'm leading. It's like I'm seated. God's saying, you stay seated because you're really imperfect. I love you, but you're imperfect. And just don't get up and try and hustle. Stay seated and don't control, and just primarily, have that expectation that all the pressure is on God to make anything happen. And I'm going to grace you with miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. And he's been doing it. And I'm like, this is so different. This is like a glorious way to live. When I'm able to say, oh, what are the things, Holy Spirit, putting a hope of perfection in? I mean, some of you can be in danger of putting too much hope in your future husband or wife being imperfect. I've seen that so many times. And so you basically end up staying single because unconsciously you're like, well, they've got to be absolutely perfect. The Bible says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. Sorry ladies, he just says it, yeah, they're fine, they're good. Wives are good, they're good things. But a wife is a wonderful source of joy, and there's also a little bit of tension every so often. He who finds kids finds a good thing. Some of you in Sanctuary are experiencing the reality that kids are an amazing blessing, and they're also a little bit of a challenge sometimes. Our hope for perfection cannot be in ourselves. It cannot be in our leadership. It cannot be in our financial security. As we think about buildings, it's just a building. I think about we're even as a church plant are considering, God, where do you want us for a building? I'm aware I can unconsciously make this super intense and be like, oh, it's got to be perfect. And actually it's like, no, it really doesn't have to be perfect. It's just a building, and no building's going to be perfect ever. And it's he who finds a building finds a good thing. It's fine. But this is actually about Jesus being the perfect one. And he can use totally imperfect buildings in imperfect situations to bring glory to him nevertheless. It's so releasing when we start to realize, no, these things don't have to be perfect. I remember, and with this I'll finish, years ago, an older gentleman who at first, when I led the church in Canterbury, was a real ally. But over time, he started to sort of become more and more critical. And eventually, he wrote me this kind of long, like machine gun letter of all these reasons why he was leaving. And at first, when I read it, I was a little bit defensive and kind of like, how dare you, And then as I read it I again and thought about it, I felt that God just gave me some wisdom of like, do you know what? In many ways, what he's actually saying kind of theoretically kind of got some truth in it. But that's okay, because this church doesn't have to be perfect. You know, Paul, when he's talking about the church, he says, the church is a jar of clay. You know, he's just saying it's just a jar of clay. See, one of the problems in this Christian life, one of the big things, is when we get the jar of clay confused with the treasure that's inside the jar of clay. When we make the jar of clay something that has to be the treasure, the church itself has to be perfect, we lose all joy in an imperfect thing. And it's so common for us as Christians to get hurt. And at root, it's actually because we aren't functionally, daily learning to put those hearts that are such sensitive things, leaning on the hope of the person of our dear friend Jesus, mainly, to be perfect. But we're unconsciously actually putting it on, my role that I'm hoping will open up, or on the leader to understand my exact viewpoint, or on that small group to function in a really perfect way. And as I thought about this with this older gentleman, I was able to write back to him and say, do you know what, in some ways you're probably right. We probably should worship in the way that you suggest, and we probably should break bread in that way sometimes, and we probably should pray more, and we probably should be more on mission. But you know what? I love this church despite her imperfection. This church, despite all of her imperfections, which will never go away, is still the dwelling place of God, as Ephesians tells us. It is still the place where the perfect God totally is content to say, there my presence dwells. In the mystery of God, an imperfect church is still the dwelling place of the perfect God. And so we can just see church as a good thing. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it never will be perfect. And just as you can say more and more in the Christian life, do you know what? I don't have to be the perfect parent. I want to be. But I don't have to be crushed by guilt when I get it wrong, because I can point to the perfect Jesus to my kids, who's never snappy and never grumpy. I don't have to be the perfect spouse, although I want to be as good as I can. But when I muck up, there's always hope. There's no shame. I can point to Jesus, even with my spouse. You see, one of the true marks of a really mature older man or woman, and as I'm now 43 and I've been seeking out more and more just time with older men and women, one of the things I've spotted in all of them is what I would call like a grounded joy. That they have learnt the secret that Jesus alone is our perfect hope, and that we and nobody else can ever fill that hole. And it's almost like, you know, when you're younger, you've got this sort of expectation of being spectacular. But with these older men and women, I'm seeing in all of them this joy that comes from them going, do you know, the older I've got, the more I am just so grateful that I haven't totally screwed up everything. You know, it's more like, I can't believe anything has gone well. It's not that I'm thinking I should be spectacular. It's more like, man, I am so aware of how imperfect I am. The older I've got, the more I'm so grateful for your kindness to me, Jesus, despite my imperfections. That I still have a heartbeat, and I still have food before me, and I have clothes on my back, and I have friends around me, and an imperfect but a still wonderful church community, and a place and a city to live, and good works prepared in advance. Man, this is the good news that we can genuinely proclaim from the rooftops to a city and a Bay Area that is looking for things to be stable and permanent and perfect. We can say, hey, you know what? That desire is a good desire, but the Christian faith still proclaims 2,000 years later that that craving is actually only found in the person of Jesus Christ, who is alive today and lives to make intercession for his people.